Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming today. I know this is an unusual day. We usually meet on Wednesdays, but we're just so fortunate and so grateful that Joe is in town this week, and this was the day that she was available, so we made ourselves available. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Joe Ivester. Ivester. Joe is coming to us from Austin, Texas, and she's a published author. She's written 2 books, the last one of which is Once a Girl, Always a Boy. And let me just read you some description. The title of her talk today is The Politics of Raising a Transgender Child. And it is a look at what it's like to have a transgender son in a world not quite ready for people like him. Jo describes her son's experiences going back to early childhood when he first showed signs of being transgender. By sharing these stories, Jo aims to help her audience become more comfortable with transgender individuals and challenges them to recognize the discrimination this community faces. So just a little bit more about Jo. In addition to her talks with students, church and temple groups, service organizations, and book clubs, Jo testifies before legislative and administrative bodies on proposed legislature and policies that impact the transgender community. She's a former college professor, so she's well experienced in talking before groups, and of course with her book and her advocacy for transgender people, she's really had a lot of experience in talking with folks. So welcome, and we're so glad to have you.
Thank you very much. First, let me do a sound check. Can everybody hear me? Is this,
Yes.
This is good. Okay, I'm getting the thumbs up from my husband back there in the yellow shirt and glasses, and so that's a good way for me to introduce him. He's very much a part of the advocacy story that you're going to be hearing today. We've really been partners in these efforts, though I'm the one that likes getting up on the stage and talking, and he engages more one-on-one, though I've seen him testify at the Capitol, and he's amazing. So my name is Jo Ivester. My pronouns are she and her. 32 years ago, we welcomed our son Jeremy into the world as what we thought was our daughter, and we were wrong. All through childhood, though, we didn't figure it out because we didn't have the understanding, the terminology, the context to realize who Jeremy was. He thought of himself as a tomboy. That's what we called him. That's what he called himself. We didn't realize that when he said tomboy, he was picturing something very different from when we said tomboy. He thought it was a special kind of boy. We thought it was what I had been, and so many of my friends growing up in the 1960s, that we were little girls who wanted to be able to do all the things that little boys got to do. And so it was, in some ways, a political statement to say, I'm a tomboy. And it's just delightful to see how our society has changed. And girls today can enjoy their femininity and still have so many of the opportunities that their brothers and their male cousins have. But that's not where we were when Jeremy was a kid. We said tomboy, he said tomboy. That wasn't right. But it wasn't until he was in his 20s that he started to really figure things out. At 23, he had top surgery to give himself a more masculine profile. At 24, he asked everybody to start using his new name and pronouns, and he went on hormones to change his voice and his general appearance and to grow a beard. And then a year later, he changed his name legally. So his journey, although it goes back to childhood, we didn't really know what was going on until much later. So today I'm basically going to share some of the stories going back to 4-year-old Jeremy so that you can just have greater understanding. And the reason that we do that is because right now, in our culture in the US, transgender people are not very well understood or recognized. And the whole concept is unusual to many people, to most people. And when you don't understand something, it's easy to be frightened by it or even to hate it. And when you do understand, it becomes much easier to accept. So we're trying to build acceptance through gathering with folks exactly like you, and we love the League of Women Voters. My gosh, talk about an accepting group that's making a difference. So thank you for the work that you're all doing. We meet, as you heard, with church groups, temple groups, and one by one, we're hoping that folks can, by learning our story and seeing that, you know, we're just a normal family, that it's gonna help. And we see it helping. So we're very lucky with what we get to do. Before I get into sharing the actual stories, I want to give a little bit of background information. Basically looking just at terminology. What does the term transgender mean? And I know that most of you probably are already familiar with it, you've heard it, and you have your own definition. But terminology keeps changing, and we keep trying to keep up. And so I wanted to share with you what it means specifically for Jeremy. So in Jeremy's case, when he was a baby, when he was born, the doctor looked at his anatomy and said, this is a little girl. That didn't match, as Jeremy got older and started to have a sense of identity, it didn't match the gender that he knew himself to be, which was a little boy. When someone's identity that they know themselves to be doesn't match the way they were identified at birth, that's when you call them transgender. And Jeremy's just one example. We could have kind of the opposite, where the doctors say, look at the anatomy and say, well, this is a little boy, but in fact, inside, that kid starts to recognize, no, I'm a girl. So that would be a transgender girl. And it may not be as binary as that. You may have heard the phrase non-binary. You may have a kid that gets identified by the doctors as a little girl who says, well, yeah, I'm kind of a little girl, but I'm also kind of a little boy, and I'm a little bit of both. And that would be a transgender person. Or someone who says, no, I'm not a boy or a girl. I'm neither one. Or anywhere on this wonderful spectrum in between. So cisgender is kind of the opposite. I'm cisgender. What that means is when the doctors looked at me, they said, this is a little girl. And from my earliest memories, I knew I was a girl. And I ask you to think about your earliest memories. From when people would first say, are you a boy or a girl? You probably had something come to mind, even if you were only 2 or 3 years old. For me, the answer was, I'm a girl. And that makes me cisgender. So that's the definition and the why I do this, why I get out and talk. I want to cover one more thing that you'll pick up in the way I talk. And that is that I always refer to Jeremy as Jeremy, and I will use male pronouns. Because that's who he is, and that's how I think of him when he was a child, even if my image of him is wearing a dress. When I think about that now, I think about a little boy wearing a dress. In my book, which hopefully some of you have seen now, maybe some of you have read, Once a Girl, Always a Boy, I actually refer to Jeremy by his birth name, which was Emily. And I refer to him as she, until that point in time when he announced to the world, I'm Jeremy, I'm he. And that was a tough decision as a writer and as an advocate, because that's considered actually rude. So when I referred to Jeremy by his birth name or by she, fellow advocates and trans individuals would say, oh, that's wrong, haven't you learned? And I first wrote the book referring to Jeremy by Jeremy and by he. My editor looked at it and said, Joe, by doing that, you are denying your readers the opportunity to come on the journey with you. And that's when I came up with this compromise of referring to him as she in the first part of the book and as he in the second part. And I wrote a foreword that basically explains that. And I went to Jeremy and I said, would this be okay? And he said, yeah, he understood what my editor was saying, and he said, that's okay. And then I went to fellow advocates and I said, is this okay? And they said, you know, I'm not really sure. This is a really tough question. What does Jeremy say? And then I went to some advocates who happened to be trans themselves. And they were actually more accepting than the cisgender advocates. And they said, if this is okay with Jeremy, it's okay with me. So after asking over a dozen people and several organizations what they thought, I came up with the compromise that's in the book. However, when I'm talking, and we only have this 1 hour together, I will always refer to him as Jeremy, even when I'm telling a story. Even if I'm reading an excerpt from the book, I've actually changed it. And it's partly because it just is so uncomfortable for me, after training myself for the last 8 years, to say Jeremy and he. Saying his birth name and she don't roll off my tongue. And I know that it's hurtful to a trans person to hear their birth name or to hear the wrong gender. And so, for those reasons, just go with the flow with me and recognize that I'm going to describe Jeremy as he, even when he was a little kid, so even before we knew. So I think that covers kind of the introduction, the why, the what, the how. If I were a journalist, I think I'd have to be throwing in the where, Texas, so very liberal Texas. That certainly had an influence on our political involvement. And the when, also very influential, because until a few years ago, this wasn't getting a lot of attention. And because you are a politically aware group, I'm going to throw in some more political comments than I usually do. And I will share with you my personal theory as to why the last few years have been so tough. And I believe it's a backlash, that after gay marriage became the law of the land, that folks that were bothered by that were looking for an issue that they could draw together other people that were upset about that and get elected into office, and they actually focus grouped it and said, what's going to carry, what's going to get the voters out? And it was, oh, let's beat up on trans people. And I'm being really blunt, and that's just my opinion, but I think that's the win. I think that's why this time in our history we're seeing such a problem, because trans people have been around as long as we've had people. And schools have figured out how to support the kids. And it's worked, but lately it's just been hard. It's been really hard in states like Texas. So let me go back now, though, to when Jeremy was 4 years old. And Jeremy was a really, really happy little kid. He was one of those bouncy kids that he'd never stand still. You think I walk around up here a lot? Jeremy would have paced a trail back and forth across the stage. I'd see him go to the neighbors across the street, and he would be knocking on the front door to see if his friend could come out and play. And I'd watch out the window because he was only 4 years old, so I didn't want him out there by himself. And he'd be at the door knocking, and he couldn't stay still. He was so exuberant and so enthusiastic and happy. And he had, just in our neighborhood, a group of little boys that happened to all be the same age, and they welcomed him into their group. They didn't care what was under his clothes. What they cared about was that he was happy. That made him be a lot of fun, and he was really good at sports, and he had a big brother that would teach them all how to play football, and they'd run around in our front yard playing football and baseball and basketball and any sport that included a ball. And Jeremy was a part of that. He was happy, and we could see his joy. And we weren't pushing him to be more feminine. As children of the 60s ourselves, we were very aware of wanting our kids to not grow up with sexual stereotypes. So we have 4 kids. We had our oldest daughter, and then our oldest son, and then Jeremy, who we thought was our daughter, but turns out to be our son, and then another son. And in each case, we wanted them to be able to dress the way they wanted to dress, to pursue the kinds of subjects that they wanted to pursue. My first major in college was physics, and I can remember being at a party and having someone say to me upon hearing what my major was, saying, "Wait a minute, I thought you were a girl." Well, that was the end of that flirtation. But we didn't want that for our kids. So when Jeremy was being what we thought was a tomboy, we were fine with that. He had hand-me-down clothes from his big brother and his big sister. He always picked the hand-me-down boy clothes. So the one thing that was a little bit different, though, was that his hair was longer than what the boys would wear. He had his hair down around his shoulders. And at one point, a place opened up that catered to short haircuts for little boys, and Jeremy wanted to go there. Not to get his hair cut real short, but just because he liked the environment and that they were targeting little boys and all his friends were going there. So I called ahead of time to schedule an appointment, and I said, by the way, my kid's hair is long, and this isn't the haircut that I see in all of your commercials. They were doing this big ad campaign on TV because they had just opened up. They said, "Don't worry, no problem, bring your kid in, we'll give a haircut." Well, it was a little bit of false advertising. We get there, and Jeremy is sitting down in the chair, and the woman cutting his hair, who was just very delightful, didn't really know how to cut longer hair. And Jeremy, at 4 years old, had enough of an artistic sense that he knew he was getting a bad haircut. And he's pulling on his hair on one side, trying to make it longer, because one side was so much longer than the other, and it just looked unbalanced. And I could see him trying not to look sad, because he was a middle kid and wanted to please everybody, but I could tell he was bothered. And so I decided to say something, and with that I'm going to switch over to reading a brief excerpt from my book. And so this is in the early pages of the book. If anyone has the book with them and wants to follow along, I'm going to say don't, because I've changed it enough by cutting things that it'll be hard to follow. So just listen and picture Jeremy and me in the haircutting salon, and little Jeremy's trying to look happy. "Don't worry, sweetie. I'll fix it when we get home." Jeremy trusted me. He stopped squirming in his seat, smiled at the hairdresser, and settled in to wait. The moment he was done, he jumped up and ran to the car, saying, "Mommy, it's okay, you'll make it better." I didn't know until an hour later just how prophetic his words had been. The moment we got home, we headed straight for the bathroom. I dragged my desk chair in from my study and placed it facing the mirror. Jeremy climbed up, eager to see how I was going to change his bedraggled appearance. "Have you ever done this before?" "Sure," I answered, with more confidence than I felt. "Oh, I used to trim Ben's hair all the time." Ben is big brother. "What are you going to do? How do you know where to cut? Will it look like Ben when you're done?" His questions tumbled out so fast that I couldn't answer them, so I just went to work. I had to trim the hair really short before I could get it to look right. I don't know whether it was my inexperience with the scissors or the growing grin on Jeremy's face, but for some reason, I kept on cutting. And the more I cut, the more Jeremy beamed. By the time I was done, he looked exactly like Big Brother Ben had 3 years earlier. He had a traditional boy's haircut. Parted at the side, clipped neatly around the ears. I didn't have the words to explain why Jeremy was so ecstatic, but for the first time since becoming aware of how he looked, I could tell that he liked what he saw. Despite not understanding completely, I shared his joy. It didn't matter to me that his pleasure in looking like a boy was unusual. All I cared about as a mother was that somehow, in some way, I'd made my child happy. And he was happy. His elementary school years were great. That next day after the haircut, he went to preschool. And all his little kid friends were confused. Because in Texas at that time, little boys had short hair and little girls had long hair. And here this kid shows up that they used to thinking of as a girl, and he looks like a boy. And so they were just asking him bluntly, the way little kids will do, are you a boy or a girl? And he told me about this when he got home. And I said, well, what did you say? And he told me he didn't answer them. He loved the fact that his friends thought, maybe I'm a boy. Now, if we had known then what we know today, the red flag would have gone up that said, hey, your kid may be trans, do something. We might have been able to go to his school nurse or his pediatrician and say, what's going on? But we didn't have those resources. We had total unawareness ourselves. And so we just kind of muddled through. And that worked through elementary school. Tomboy Jeremy, just fine. One of the things he loved was sleepovers with his friends. And that was the first problem. So when he was about 8, maybe 9 years old, one of the moms called about a sleepover that was scheduled for that night, and basically said, Jeremy can't stay over, except she didn't say Jeremy, she used Jeremy's name. And at first I thought she was saying that she was canceling the whole evening, that there were problems. I'm saying, oh, hey, no problem, the kids can come stay at our place. And she said, no, you don't get it. Emily is too old to sleep with the boys. And like that, Jeremy was excluded. And once one mom said he couldn't stay over, all the moms said he couldn't stay over. And in the same time frame, the little boys no longer wanted to play with him. Partly because he wasn't a part of the gang as defined by the sleepovers, and partly because they were starting to hit puberty about a year or so after this had happened, and they were interested in what they defined as girly girls. They didn't want to play with a tomboy. They wanted to be flirting with a girl who would flirt back. And so Jeremy was kind of left on his own. He didn't fit in with the girls. They were all clustered together. The girls would hang out together and the boys would hang out together by the time they got to middle school. And he didn't fit in with the girls, but he didn't fit in with the boys either. And so he felt very alone. I'm going to share another couple of paragraphs with you that go back to those middle school days. And I should mention he was playing football. He was viewed as the only girl to ever have played football both 7th and 8th grade at that particular middle school. He was kind of a hero for doing that. The girls thought this is awesome. If they would interact with him, they said, this is great that you're standing up for women's rights. And he said, I'm not doing this to be political. I just like to play football. That's who he was. And he wrote, he said, we wrote the book together, so this is now in his voice as a middle schooler. When we're on the field and suited up, my teammates forget that I'm a girl. With my shoulder pads and helmet, I don't look any different from them, and we're all caught up in the game. But I feel left out because we're no longer friends off the field. I thought 6th grade was tough, but 7th grade is even worse when it comes to not fitting in. One day as we were hanging out before practice, waiting for the coaches to show up, I walked up to a group of guys who were laughing together. When I got there though, they all went quiet. Whatever they were talking about, they didn't want to discuss it in front of me. Maybe it was girls or their bodies, but it made me really uncomfortable. So I climbed into the stands to sit alone, thinking, it's okay that they don't want me around. I can deal. But I couldn't. I couldn't make the feeling go away. My throat hurt and my chest tightened, and I felt isolated and deserted as I thought about how long it had been since I'd hung out with my teammates, like when we were little kids. I no longer had a social life. Well, middle school is hard for everybody. Puberty is hard for everybody, but it's even harder when you're transgender. And it's even harder when you're transgender and experience something called gender dysphoria, which means that that the way your body is doesn't feel right. And so as Jeremy hit puberty and his breasts started to develop, he felt like his body was fighting him. It was doing something he didn't want. And he'd look around at his big sister or at the girls in his class, and they were so excited at the changes. And they wanted to dress in a way that made the changes obvious, and they were showing off and they were proud of their bodies. And Jeremy instead would walk around with his shoulders hunched over, trying to hide his body. And he'd wear sweatshirts in Austin in the summertime when it was 100 degrees out, because that hid his body more. So it was tough. Well, we didn't know because he threw himself into school activities. You already know he was an athlete. Well, he played every sport he possibly could. He not only played football, he was playing soccer and basketball, and he ran track. He placed second in district on hurdles. In fact, when they had the middle school graduation ceremony, one of the items in the program was to award a best boy athlete and a best girl athlete for the school. And the gym coach that had was up there announcing the best boys athlete, made his announcement, sat down, and the coach that had worked with the girls stood up. And she said, I'm actually not going to be the one to make the announcement of the best girl athlete. And she brought the football coach back up. And then he brought Jeremy up. And so Jeremy got that recognition, and on one hand he was thrilled and happy because he worked so hard and he loved the sports, but he would have given anything to have been the one to receive the boys' recognition. Our whole school systems are set up to separate out gender, and that makes it so hard for the kids who are exploring their gender, or who have already explored and know that they don't fit with what everybody else is expecting. And that's a change that we need to bring into play somehow. There's no reason for kindergarten teachers to have the little boys line up separately from the little girls when they go to the cafeteria. But every time the teacher did that, Jeremy felt like he was in the wrong line. So he finishes middle school, he throws himself into sports, he joined the art club, he became president of the art club, he joined the school band. So John and I look at what we think is a well-adjusted kid, except that we knew he didn't have friends the way he did when he was in elementary school. He'd say, bring your friends over, come hang out the way they used to. And it turned out he just didn't have the friends. He was alone. College was great for him, though. He was over at Montana State, and he found a group of friends that didn't care, again, what was under his clothes, just like the kids in elementary school. So he could wear his hair short, he could wear men's clothing. People would think he was maybe a 14 or 15-year-old teenage boy instead of a 18 or 19-year-old young woman. But he was okay with that. He didn't like being thought of as young, but he sure loved being thought of as a boy. And it wasn't until he started talking that people would realize, wait a minute, this is what they perceive to be a woman. So he's wrestling with that, and then he's wrestling with his body. And he decided to take the major step of having top surgery. Top surgery is essentially like a mastectomy, a double mastectomy, with a little bit of added forming so that you end up with a masculine profile. And Jeremy did all his studying, he picked a doctor, he got it all lined up without telling us. And in the meantime, his big sister had said, I'm getting married, and you're gonna be my maid of honor. Well, Jeremy hadn't worn a dress for years, and you probably noticed that being a maid of honor is a pretty feminine thing to do. And Jeremy had said yes, because this was his big sister, and he loved his big sister, and he didn't want to disappoint his sister. But right from the beginning, he knew that it wasn't going to work, that he couldn't wear the dress. And he agonized over it, and it really brought things to a head for him. And after a huge amount of soul searching, he finally came to his sister, and without explaining that he had surgery scheduled, without explaining that he was suffering from gender dysphoria, he said, I can't wear the dress. But what I can do, if you will still have me by your side for the ceremony, I can wear the same slacks as the groomsmen and a white shirt, and I'll have a vest made that matches all of the bridesmaids' dresses. And that's what he did. And he stood by his sister's side. And the extended family that was there, they just accepted him. They didn't say, oh, what's he doing not wearing a dress? It was just, oh, he looks so cute. He told me later he would have rather they say he looked really handsome. But we were cute at the time. Well, a lot happened in the next few months. We had a second wedding. His big brother got married, and his brother's fiancée, now my daughter-in-law, had asked him to be one of the bridesmaids. And again, he had said yes. And again, he was having trouble dealing it, but now he didn't have to say anything, because the sister and the future sister-in-law got together and said, you know what, we're going to have the same thing going on. What are you going to do? And so my daughter-in-law and my oldest son got together, made a decision. They called Jeremy and said, you know what, how about, would you like to just, how about if you just wear the same outfit that all the men are wearing? We'll rent one for you too. Jeremy was ecstatic. And then came the second part of the proposal. Don't stand with the bridesmaids. Stand with the groomsmen. Stand by my side with all the men. Now, we didn't have the understanding yet. We didn't have the language, but the love was there. And the acceptance. And that was incredible. Well, by the time the wedding actually happened, Jeremy had shared with the family that he was going to have surgery. And I flew to Florida, met up with him there. There weren't a whole lot of surgeons in the country that did the surgery at that point. He found one in Florida that was great. They did this day in and day out, and Jeremy had studied the pictures, the before and after pictures. We stayed in a motel right near the hospital. He had the procedure done, and he was so incredibly happy with the way he looked for about 3 months. And after 3 months, he said, well, this is great. And I love having a flat chest and a male profile, but it's not enough. I want to have a deep voice. I want to have facial hair. Now, he still couldn't say I'm transgender. He'd explored it a little bit, and in his own mind, being trans was just too big a change, and he was terrified of change. And he didn't want to disappoint anybody. So he said, I'm going to go on hormones and I'm going to change my name, but I'm not saying that I'm transgender. Well, over the course of the next few months, he explored more and more what it means to be transgender, and he accepted himself. We had more conversations with him, made it clear we were perfectly okay with him going on hormones. This was easier to me than him having the surgery. That this seemed so natural at this point. And we just didn't know when it was all going to happen. And I didn't know that I'd already picked his name. What had happened during that week that we spent in the motel room with surgery was he said to me, this is as far as I'm going to take this, but if I decide to declare myself transgender and a man and express myself as a man, I don't want a name that's a popular baby name today. I want a name that you and Dad would have picked when I was born. And so all that week we talked about names. And one of the names I had proposed was Jeremy. And in his usual very laid back self, he said, yeah, that's a possibility. I didn't know. It stuck. He liked the name. And so one day I'm looking on Facebook and I see a posting from him. And it says, hey guys, you may have noticed that my name's changed and my profile's picture is different. From now on, please call me Jeremy. Use male pronouns, he, him, his. And in a couple weeks, I'm going to go on hormones, which means I'm going to go through a male puberty like many of you did when you were 13, 14 years old. And my voice is going to deepen. And maybe I'll grow a beard. Bye. And with that, he announced it to the world. Well, then I followed up with my own announcement. And I posted basically the same information he did, but then added how proud of him I was. And that he was the bravest man I know, and had demonstrated so much courage to explore and discover and declare his authentic self. And that we had been with him every step of the way and would continue by his side wherever his journey took him. Well, that post went viral. And I started to get Facebook messages from friends of friends of friends, people I'd never met. And at first they were very positive, and they were a lot of them from young adults that were somewhere in the LGBTQ community saying, thanks for being such an accepting mom. And I'm thinking, okay, good, pat on the back, I'm being a good mom here. And then I got some sadder letters. And they were from transgender young men who had a different story to tell. When they had come out to their parents, when they were 15, 16 years old, they'd been kicked out of their homes. They lived on the street. And my heart broke. To think of these 15 and 16-year-old kids that are already dealing with so much, with the pain of gender dysphoria, and they were trying so hard to figure themselves out, and then to have their parents throw them out on the street. Their church communities deny them, say, we don't want you here anymore. And in Texas, that was a big deal, because in many of the small towns in Texas, the church community is the major community. And John and I talked about it, and we said we have to do something. And so we asked if Jeremy would mind if we became very public advocates. And Jeremy understood, and he said I could write a book about it, and he said we could speak about it and share his story. And not long after that, there was a big dinner, a big fundraiser for the Anti-Defamation League, which is a big anti-discrimination organization, national. Some of you, I'm seeing nods, you've heard of it. And John and I were given the opportunity to speak for 4 minutes each at this gathering of 600 or 700 people. And John picked that moment to say to this room full of our friends and colleagues and strangers, my son is transgender, and we can't discriminate against my son and others like him. And Jeremy was there, sitting at the table with the rest of the family, and he was stunned. He knew that his dad was going to say something, but he didn't know exactly what. And after John stopped speaking, the room just kind of erupted with applause. And Jeremy didn't wait for John to get back to our table. He stood up and he raced toward John as he was walking back, and the two of them stood there and embraced. And anyone who hadn't gotten choked up before, when they watched father and son embrace like that, then they got choked up. And that was one huge step into political advocacy. What we learned was that transgender people face a really hard time. Over 40% of transgender teens have tried to die by suicide. Not just thought about it, they've actually tried to die. We have friends who found out their kids were trans in the form of a suicide note. We have friends who have said to us when they've heard me share that statistic with audiences, they've come to me afterwards and said, I don't know if you knew, but I'm one of that 40%. This is very real. And in Texas, while individuals may be very accepting, and we've found a wonderful advocacy community, our politicians are using a fear of transgender people as a political weapon to gain political points, and it's working. They're staying in office, or they're getting elected to office, and we're trying to stop it. In the last legislative session in Texas, we had over 70 bills that got proposed that were anti-LGBTQ. And we were able to stop most of them. When I say we, the advocacy community, we would gather at the Capitol and rally and have speeches, and then those of us who were comfortable doing so would go door to door and speak to our senators and our House members. And John and I have done it in DC as well. And said, this is a family with a trans son. This is what we look like. We're normal. We work. We pay taxes. John was an executive with a high-tech company and would say, you know what, when Texas gets a reputation for discriminating, you make it harder for me to attract the youngest, the brightest talent coming out of school. Because the new college students don't want to live in a place with a reputation for discrimination. And so we continue that battle. And now it's come to our school boards. In our own town, just north of Boston, we just recently had 3 school board members elected, and they ran on a platform of saying, don't indoctrinate our children. Well, indoctrination is a kind of a code word for saying, don't teach about racial relations, don't teach about having LGBTQ students here at our school, don't say the word gay. So Texas is trying to catch up with Florida. So when those candidates won in our own town, our response was to say, what can we do? Grassroots community building and political organizing. And we said, let's create a PFLAG chapter. PFLAG is Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays. And now they just use the acronym because the words are not broad enough, because now we have a whole alphabet soup of LGBTQIA++, 2S, and so many different definitions, and we want to embrace all of that. So we started with an organizing meeting that we thought was going to be half a dozen people, and we held it in a bookstore that was not a big bookstore. It wasn't set up for a lot of people to be there. And we had 30 people show up, standing room only. They were backed up into the aisleways where the books were. And everyone said, yes, we need this. And someone let the newspaper know about it, and they published an article, and they called me and said, do you have an email for your new group? I said, what? We are so new, we don't have an email yet, but you know what? I'm a public figure, use mine. So my name and email address went into that article, and I started getting letter after letter, and we've now doubled in size in a month. And now, Monday night, this coming Monday night when we get back to Austin, I'll be standing up at the school board meeting saying, it's time to change the official school board policy so that your non-discrimination statement says we are not going to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation, gender expression, or gender identity. And we've been meeting with school board members. We've been meeting with the staff at the school that are responsible for the students' well-being and counseling and the student handbook and anti-bullying. And we're going to make a difference. And within the League of Women Voters, I know that you know how important this grassroots organizing is. And I don't know whether it's 5 years from now or 10 years from now or 20 years from now, but we will get there. I am very optimistic, and it's because I look at the acceptance of the young people. The high schoolers, they just accept when their friends are trans. They have no trouble with changing pronouns, with changing the names that they call people. It's taken the older generations a little bit longer, but that younger generation is going to be stepping up, and those are our future school board members. And those are the people that we're gonna be bringing along. They are our future advocates. So with that, my ask of you is to become advocates yourself. You already are in so many ways, and I'm hoping that you will embrace the battle that transgender people face for recognition. And when your state legislators propose bills, which they have done, that are anti-trans, that you speak up. And I know that in many cases you're already trying to vote them out of office. I hope that hearing from me today about my son and the battles that we faced in Texas, I hope that just energizes you to keep fighting. And I can't express enough how much I appreciate what you do. Because you are the voices that are going to make the world better for my son.